Good day, I'm Vincent Saxtetter, and this is the After the Age of Fire channel. This is episode 46, recorded on May 16th, 2026, but it will be released on May 23rd, so as not to overlap with the previous one. The title is Worldwide Geopolitical Shell Games and Fake Growth. So it's one particular way that the world economic growth that we see might be fake, and it ties into geopolitics. It's my first real discussion of geopolitics in this channel. I expect there to be a lot more. This is a prepping channel. It's for you and for your family line to help you flourish, thrive, and reproduce during this transition from the previous era ending around now into the next era. The previous era was one in which the world consumption was doubling every 22 years or so. So just about, if you averaged across the world's population, we had about twice as much of everything every 22 years. These doublings are finishing sometime around now. And we're in a transition into the coming era, and with no more doublings like this. And we'll be using a bit less energy, similar to the amount that we used worldwide in 1970, about 30,000 calories per person per day. By comparison, right now we use about twice as much. That comes 46,000 calories, mostly in coal, oil, and gas. Well, that's 41,000 calories in those sources, and about 5,000 from what we call renewables, and then another 15,000 calories from food, fodder, and wood. That's the 60,000 that we have today, and it will reduce to 30,000 or so. If you want to hear more about that, look to channel to episodes 10 to 37 or so, in the 38 in this channel. We're now in the second section of this channel's content, which started in episode 39. Right now on 46. And this second section is about the transition between the era of doublings to the coming era. How would we recognize the transition as it happens, and where are we in it? Has it started already, or is it yet to come? This is more observational than predictive. I can't predict all the patterns that might happen as we transition between doublings to a bit lower growth, but I can observe what's going on in the world around us and reach some conclusions. I did make one prediction in episode 31. Is that 39? It's that our supplies of easy coal, easy oil, and easy gas will require generations to give out. So this transition to 30,000 calories, at least if it's up to if it's determined by our mineral resources, will take generations. If it's up to us, perhaps things could go faster, like in a war or something like that. But that won't be because we've run out of minerals, it'll be because of us. And then episodes 43 to 44 were a statement that we will not kill all of us. We do have a death wish, a major death wish. We use all sorts of means to kill as many of us as we can, but we don't seem to have the control as a human race to kill off every single one of us. We could very well kill some billions of ourselves, but right now there are some 8 billion of ourselves and we won't get them all. Now currently we're on episode 46, which with the previous episode 45 are about, it's hard to be sure that the economic growth passed from above 30,000 calories. 30,000 calories is where we were around 1970. It's hard to be sure that the economic growth that we've seen there is completely real. It might be something more like a fast food meal or a single-use piece of clothing, say what's called a poncho, a piece of thing that's supposed to keep you dry at one time. The real numbers of our growth may actually be lower or even negative. We may not be growing as much as we think we are, or we may have actually been in recession without knowing it for decades already. So one way that could work that I discussed is that we may be producing more things but just lower quality, getting less of what we really need. Now this episode is one particular way that fake growth can occur, and one that I think is underway in a big way, and it's a global geopolitical shell game. So, and actually there have been several shell games, and right now we're in a particular repeat of the same dynamic. You know what a shell game is? It's a game where you have 3 cups on a desk or on a table, and under one of those cups there's a bean or something, and you are supposed to watch as somebody else moves these cups around and does tricks with them, and you're supposed to, and you know at the beginning which of the cups the bean is in, okay, but the trickster in front of you, who's amusing you hopefully and perhaps trying to secure some of your money for himself, is playing tricks with your eyes and trying to confuse you about where that bean is, moving the cups around in intricate and fascinating ways until you say, oh, it's there, and he picks up the cup and it's not there. The bean, there's still one bean, but it's not where you think it is. That's the shell game. That's what I'm talking about with a global shell game. The story has been that is that in general all countries around the world have been growing economically. They've all been getting richer over the last decades. The richer countries are getting richer more slowly. So like Italy has been doubling its economy at a rate that would be one doubling every 62 years. Japan, France, and Brazil and Germany would be one doubling every 42 years, the UK and Spain every 33 years, the USA every 27 years. That's the story. And then at the same time, there are some poor countries, most are not so lucky as to have this, but there are some poor countries that have been growing extremely quickly. So India's been doubling its economy every 12 years, and China every 9 years. And then you take the richer countries, you take the poor countries that are expanding quickly and other poor countries that are not expanding so quickly, you average them together, and you do some sophisticated accounting and some evaluation of how much money is worth, how much the US dollar is worth year to year in all the countries of the world, and you arrive after a lot of number crunching at a conclusion that the world economy is expanding, has been doubling at a rate of once every 24 years. However, as I pointed out in the last episode, in order to arrive at these estimates of numerical growth, of economic growth worldwide and in individual countries, you have to know how much inflation is. So the US government says that between 1980 and 2022, the US dollar inflated by a factor of 3.74, almost 4. It almost doubled, which means that its actual value divided by around 4. So that the actual inflation was doubling at around one doubling every 21 years, or the value of the US dollar was dividing by 2 every 21 years. And once, if you believe this number, then you can reach the conclusion that the world economy was doubling at a rate of every 24 years. However, if you think that inflation number is too low, that inflation was actually worse than that, then you would reach a conclusion that the world's economy was not growing as fast as one might think. So it's hard to be sure of the inflation number. It's hard to be sure of the adjustment. And it's hard to be sure of the economy, what it's doing. And there's a question about whether you should really apply the same inflation numbers in one country as in another country, whether you can really keep track of the value of of something in one country compared to some country in some other country over decades. Uh, the way that is attempted using the current economic system. Um, uh, and then there was also, I brought up the question of whether many of these gains, even if they are real, whether they might disappear as soon as we stop trying to stimulate the economy. Now here I'm talking about zero-sum games or shell games, okay, where a shell game in the sense that I'm talking about here is where some countries get richer, some countries get poorer. In other words, maybe the richer countries that we think are getting richer are actually getting poorer, okay, while the poor countries are getting richer. And maybe overall the net wealth of the world is staying about the same or just not growing as much as we think it is. So it could be that what is happening is actually that the rich, traditionally rich countries like the United States, Europe, and Japan are actually getting poorer. Meanwhile, some other countries are getting richer, but it doesn't seem that way for the moment because the richer countries still think that they're rich. Okay. So if you think maybe they still are rich, but just maybe not as rich as they were. Okay. So it could be that the rich countries think that they're getting richer, that their economies are growing, when in fact economies might not be growing. Maybe they actually might be in recession, but it might take some decades, say after 30 years, suddenly people redo the books and it looks like there's some crisis or whatever, and people redo the books and it looks like suddenly the economy collapsed one particular year, okay, when in fact all that happened was that in that particular year somebody or a group of people recognized that this country was considerably poorer than they had thought. Okay. In fact, we should expect this sort of thing once the exponential growth, once the doublings end. We should expect after the doublings end, if everyone on average gets 30,000 calories per person per day, then we should expect that on average the world will not be growing its number of calories or its energy use or its resources consumed year on year. But what will happen instead is that at times some particular region or some particular group of people will have growth themselves, but it will be at the expense of resources consumed by other people. So other people will get poorer while the first people get richer. That's what I mean by a shell game, except for that sometimes it will be public. I guess that wouldn't be a shell game. And in some cases it will be masked. It will seem like the people who are getting poorer are not actually getting poorer. It'll look like, if you think that everyone's getting richer and you're under the illusion that the people who are actually getting poorer are staying the same or getting richer, then you think that the world's economy is growing, okay? But if the reality is that the richer are getting poorer and the poor are getting richer, then maybe the economy isn't changing at all worldwide. Okay. So I can, looking back, I think there's at least I'll talk briefly about one thing that I suspect was a shell game. There was a period of great competition between the USSR and the United States, ending around 1991. And at the end of that competition, the USSR collapsed, including an economic collapse, and in the following decade or more, the United States boomed. So overall, Russia was in decline, the United States boomed. And that looks like a transfer of wealth, certainly a transfer of power. And you can argue that even before 1991, the USSR's economy was not that great. It was maybe good at producing machines and weapons, but perhaps it wasn't doing that good job of taking care of its of the consumer needs and so on. So maybe its economy looked better than it was because it wasn't providing as well for the desires of many of its citizens as it might have. At any rate, I'm no historian, but it does look like the USSR looked stronger than it was, okay, until the moment of collapse, and then certainly after the collapse, the U.S. went through a boom, and Russia went through a period of decline that looks like a shell game, where it looked like there was more in the world than there was until 1991, more wealth, more power, and suddenly one half of it just gave way. So overall, worldwide, perhaps there never had been as much power, as much wealth during that period. But that's not my main focus. I'm going to talk about another shell game. It could also be that something some element of a shell game happened just after World War II, when there was a transfer of wealth and power from Europe to the United States. Europe lost its colonies, and it was no longer in fact, for 25 years after World War II, the United States was the producing all the factory goods for the world, practically. It was just dominant economically. It was, and that happened in the aftermath of World War II. There was certainly a transfer of power and of wealth after World War II. Whether that was a shell game, whether there was no actual increase in the world's wealth, well, I doubt that. I think my own belief, but is that actually the world was growing economically, taken as a whole, up through probably at least 1970. So I'm not sure about after 1970. I'm not sure how strong the economic growth, whether there was economic growth. It seems to me like perhaps certainly the U.S. economic growth was weaker than it seemed after 1970, and I'm not sure. But anyway, let's talk about the shell game that's really my main focus for this episode. It's what's going on with Eastern Asia compared to the United States. So in the last decades, we've seen a lot of very fast growth in Eastern Asia. First it was in Japan and Korea, Singapore and Thailand. Those were the tigers. And more recently it's in China and Vietnam and India. Those tigers are no longer growing as quickly as they used to. But we still have booms in play in China and in Vietnam. But on the other side so those are the poorer countries getting richer. But then there's also the United States, which still today its economy is, if you look at what's called the nominal GDP, its economy is at least a quarter of the world economy, even though its population is much smaller. Its population is 1/25 of the world population. So its economy is incredibly larger than its population. It's also dominant worldwide. Okay, that's according to the nominal GDP. If you make an adjustment to the GDP, saying, okay, I'll revalue the value of a dollar in a particular country based if say consumer goods are cheaper in this country, then that country has then its GDP is large. I'll say the GDP is larger to adjust for the fact that chicken is cheaper in this country. That's called a purchasing parity, purchasing power parity, way of estimating the GDP, and according to that estimate, the U.S. economy is maybe a sixth of the world economy. It's still quite large. It's still the dominant, in that case, actually China's economy is maybe a little larger than the U.S. At any rate, it's still, the U.S. economy is rather large and dominant. But what's been happening in recent years is the U.S. has been receiving many real goods from foreign countries and giving those foreign countries in exchange dollars. It's going into debt, is another way of saying it. There's something called a trade deficit. Starting from 1994, the trade deficit was always more than $100 billion per year. So that would mean around, for an average American citizen, that would mean the average American citizen was receiving $300 of goods from outside of the United States, and in return for those goods was giving dollars. So the people outside of the United States were not getting anything tangible in return. They were just getting some dollars. And that trade deficit increased and increased from 2000 until the present. The imbalance has been something between $400 and $800 billion per year. So between $2,000 and $3,000 of goods received in exchange for dollars. In 2022, it was $970 billion per year. So what's happening is the United States, the daily the items that families and companies use day to day generally all come from somewhere else, and there's many of them, a huge selection, and they're cheap, and people fill their houses, they fill their party, when you have a party or you have gift giving, all of your needs, they come from somewhere else, okay, and people are and not much is being returned for those goods. The United States is very dependent. Individual people are very, the clothing. You get the reason why Americans are able to afford having clothing or any other goods is because they're cheap. They're cheap because they're coming from other countries. So the United States is getting real things, often things that are consumer items, so that your clothing wears out after a few years, if not earlier. And other items wear out much more quickly, but they're things that wear out, and then you buy more and you buy more. And meanwhile, these other countries around the world are stockpiling U.S. dollars. They're building up huge numbers of U.S. dollars that they possess. Okay. Now, if it happened that the countries around the world that have these stockpiles of dollars decided that they wanted to trade their dollars for real things, so they wanted the U.S. to give them real things in exchange for dollars, or if they tried to sell their dollars and give them to somebody else in exchange for real things, in that case there could be a glut of dollars, because and the U.S. dollar could lose its worth, part of its worth, or and if the U.S. dollar lost its worth, then the U.S. economy, which is currently considered to be so large, could suddenly lose much of its worth. So you might you could have a scenario where instead of the U.S. economy being 1/4 of the world economy, it might suddenly divide by 5 and be 1/20th of the world economy. So if the U.S. economy and the U.S. dollar were suddenly devalued that way, or maybe not in a day, maybe it would take a generation to devalue. Okay, Um, uh, then the economies of all the countries, there are many countries that tie their affairs and their economies to the U.S. Then of course their economies would shrink too. The valuation of their economy would shrink. So um, if the U.S. economy, its value is considered to divide by 5, then so would most of the European countries and many Middle East countries and so on. In fact, the whole world's economy today is measured in dollars. So if the dollar loses its value, then the whole thing needs to be recalculated. And it's a very complex web of relationships that are used to determine the value of dollars and of goods around the world, and all that would be completely screwed up, and then you'd have to recalculate it all, and you'd come out with some number that would be considerably different. And one thing's for sure, the world economy would be smaller than it would be without that adjustment. So that's the current shell game. We have an arrangement where certain poor countries have been growing economically very quickly for decades, and meanwhile the U.S. has been trading short-term goods that wear out quickly for dollars, and it looks like the U.S. economy has been expanding at a rate, I think it was once doubling every 27 years, so it's still doing fairly well compared to the countries of Europe and Japan. But it could be that a simple readjustment, if countries decided that they didn't want the U.S. dollar so badly, that suddenly all that growth would disappear, and it would turn out that the U.S. The U.S. economy would be smaller than it was 30 or 50 years ago. So let's talk about this arrangement, and there are 4 ways of, I want to talk about 4 ways of interpreting this arrangement. I think all of them have some validity, and they all deserve some looking at. Okay, not all, actually. There's one that I really don't think is valid. So 3 out of 4 have some validity. The first 3 that I'm going to mention here were listed by David Graeber in his book Debt: The First 5,000 Years, and then I add a 4th one. Okay, the first one is that this arrangement of some countries having huge stockpiles of dollars, and then the U.S. having received so many goods, is in fact a good faith guarantee. These dollars significant a good faith guarantee that from the U.S. that it will provide valuable goods and services to the other countries if and when they're needed, and that alongside that, these countries could be using these. They may have a motive for keeping these huge stockpiles of dollars, and that motive would be insurance against various events and economic crises. So that if a country runs into some problem, it's nice to have a wad of money lying around so it can see its way through that problem. Okay. Now this is the option, this is the interpretation of this shell game that I think just doesn't hold any water at all, because the U.S. is in no position to begin producing the goods that would be required to trade to pay off its debt. Okay, its workforce is unwilling to work long hours in difficult conditions at low pay that's competitive with the pay in other countries. They're untrained. They were unwilling to get the education that was required. And the U.S. no longer possesses the know-how and the capital and the management to do the manufacturing that would be required. All that know-how and of how to build a big manufacturing business and run it has moved. It's no longer in the U.S. So if our stockpilers worldwide try to use their stockpiles, what will happen is simply that the US dollar and the US economy will collapse, and therefore the countries that stockpile dollars will also lose all the value of those dollars, or most of the value. Okay, so that's the real fact of it. This is not a good faith arrangement, agreement. The dollars are not a good faith guarantee of anything. A second interpretation is that this is what's called seigniorage, which is an economic term. It means it's a way that a powerful country exacts tribute from poorer countries. In this case, it would be a way that the United States extracts tribute from the entire world. Okay. The fact is that the U.S. Maintains a worldwide military presence, and it's able to strike anyone, anywhere, anytime. It's true that United States citizens think that they're providing great services to the world, freedom and who knows what else. It's true that efforts, if some group of people or some country or group of countries were to attempt to stop the flow of products versus dollars, to throw a wrench in the works, they would be met with violence from the United States. And it's true that if the United States is no longer dominant, its imaginary wealth will disappear. Okay, so this does look like a seigniorage system. It's getting things simply because it's militarily and dominant in other ways as well. A third interpretation doesn't look so positive for the United States. Okay, it looks more like this whole arrangement may actually be a disaster for the United States, even in the short term. Never mind what comes later. Okay, it could be that supplying goods to the United States is a way of reducing the United States to a dependent role. It's a way of whoever's supplying the goods obtaining some control over the United States. Right? Now so since I mentioned China, there is a lot of discussion about how China may be trying to obtain control over the United States. Not just China, but any country that stockpiles dollars would be doing that. The only question is, how deliberate is this, and who, and of the entire population, say of China, who's really embarked on that project, and is this really the only motive? So I'm talking about several interpretations here. So it could be that some people are trying to destroy the United States, or trying to reduce it to subservience, and other people have other agendas. So when you talk about China is trying to do something, I think this is much too simplistic. Okay. And it's true that when you supply a lot of things to somebody, then say to the United States, then the United States citizens have stopped producing things of value. We're no longer the huge manufacturing power that we were in the 60s and 50s. They get used to luxury, and they also become addicts, all sorts of addictions. You name it, it's rampant. Okay. And I don't just mean drugs, I mean like food, I mean sex, I mean media, you name it, everything that could be called an addiction grows in this sort of environment of luxury. Okay. It has grown. And in fact, I think it's a little strange that United States leaders seem to believe that they have some power to regulate or influence China's behavior, its policies and decisions. Considering how dependent the United States is on China, I don't understand why they think that they have any room to tell China what to do. It's interesting that right now fentanyl deaths, and fentanyl is apparently being supplied by China. China has some role in the fentanyl supply to the U.S. Americans are dying of fentanyl overdoses at a rate that means that over their lifetime, 1 out of 60 Americans will die of fentanyl. And for total drug deaths, 1 out of 40 will die of drug overdoses. It's huge. And just Americans have been unable to resist the opportunity to live in pleasure and luxury. And this also is reminiscent of another situation in the 1700s and 1800s, where the British wanted to be able to obtain tea from China, and what they decided the thing to do was to make sure that large numbers of Chinese were addicted to opium. They required China to allow free trade of opium, because that would, if there were opium addicts in China, they would be that would give the UK, the Britain, the leverage that it could trade in tea and get tea from China. And so it enforced opium addiction in China, and it went so far as to have 2 wars with China, one in 1839 to 1842, that the first Opium War, where the Chinese emperors tried to end this trade, and then a second one in 1856 to 1860, and in both cases the British rapidly and thoroughly trounced the Chinese, and that was the end of the Chinese empire as a going concern. So I think while this trade imbalance persists, both with China but with every other country that's stockpiling dollars and supplying goods, the U.S. cannot claim to determine its own affairs, even whether its people are safe from any particular threat, or to dictate terms to any other country. A fourth interpretation is a much different one, and this is my own suggestion. I think it's natural when somebody when you meet somebody for the first time, especially somebody who appears to be more successful or richer than you, but really anyone, it's natural to put your best foot forward. So when you meet somebody the first time and the second time, you'll look your best. You'll smile and be friendly, do your best to make good conversation, and be generous, and have fun, or impress as well as you can. And you may give a gift, a small one perhaps, or depending if it's a new business associate, then maybe you'll give a larger gift. Or if you are invited to somebody's house the first time, you may bring a bottle of wine or something special for the house. Or if you invite somebody over to your house for the first time, then you'll probably give the house a special clean ahead of time and make an extra nice dinner. Okay, because you see hope for, and you're optimistic about the possibilities of this new friendship, and you hope for a real friendship, a lasting one, a respectful one. You hope for mutual advancement, right? It's not just you trying to grift off the other person or them trying to grift off of you. You're actually hopeful, and you're trying to make the best possible start. You want to impress, and you'll probably be a bit more open-hearted and generous than you usually are. Okay. So I'm not saying everyone in a stockpiling country or in China is like this. Okay. There are many people with different motives and intentions. Okay. But I think probably most of the workers are something like this. They are, in fact, when they're running into the presence of a foreign power that's stronger than they are and richer and evidently successful, and they want to put their best foot forward, and if the best foot forward means entering into an economic relationship where they're providing goods and services, and that's what seems to be wanted, then they're more cooperative than one might expect. So when I've traveled a lot around the world, and And in general, and with the knowledge that the U.S. was getting better than getting the better side of the deal, and has been for a long time, wherever I went, I've noticed that even in countries where they probably knew that they were getting the poor end of the deal, they've still been people on the street were still very friendly and helpful and open-hearted to me in particular. And they saw me as a representative of the United States. They knew I was American. I could see it from a distance, and they were still very, very generous and friendly, and not just to take advantage of me. There have been people who wanted to take advantage, but lots of people who just liked me, and often it came down to they admired the United States. They want to move there even, but you know, not to take advantage. I'm sure there are many people who want to take advantage in the United States, but there are many people who just want to go there and do well. Okay, they envy me, but without malice. Okay, and these people, in these countries, many of the workers, they spend their whole lives working under very difficult conditions, working intensely, and they know that the rich countries benefit, and that people there live under much better conditions. They know, in effect, that they're serving people who are much more wealthy and are getting a lot more out of their lives than getting a lot more comforts and security and health care, and they still keep working at it. So, which is extraordinary. I think if I knew that I was working in grinding poverty in order to keep somebody stocked in disposable plastic items for their children, or for their dinners, or for their creature comforts, and meanwhile I didn't have any of those plastic items for myself, and I was working under much worse conditions, I think it's very tempting to live in hatred. Okay, and clearly this is not what the average worker is doing in most of these countries. Instead, I suspect that they have a secret love for the rich countries that they're supplying with goods. They certainly, their actions, just they're unstinting with their lives and their service, and they're willing to give huge service, to devote their entire lives to that service without getting that much in return. That doesn't look like hatred. That looks like love, even though they may not admit it. And many of them actually do act. If you meet them, they're just unabashed, just wanting to be your friend, and not often not in a manipulative way. They just like you. So I've covered 4 interpretations. One is good faith guarantees and promises between the USA and other countries. No, this is not what's going on. That's not the meaning of this shell game. The second one is seigneurage, tribute, where the U.S. comes out ahead until everything collapses. It's a way of taxing things as long as the empire persists. The third one is a way of controlling or even ruining the U.S. through a system of golden handcuffs, of Trojan horses, of reducing Americans to being addicts. And the fourth one is a kind of love, of trying to be your best for a new rich friend. And maybe that's what many of the countries of the world have been doing, more or less. Maybe their leaders have other things in mind. Certainly many people have darker motives. But overall, I suspect a large portion of the population of these countries have been doing it more or less out of a secret love. Maybe not so secret, at least to themselves. So I think the last 3, the seigneurage, the attempts to control the U.S., and the putting your best out for the new rich friend, they may be all true at the same time. There are many actors, many motives, many intentions. And also there's a logic that goes beyond any particular person and any particular agenda and intention. But regardless of the interpretation, the fact is that what we have is a shell game. The US dollars are not worth what we think they are. The global valuation scheme of trying to determine value in individual countries for every country and trying to figure out the value of every country's economy is a failure. The real power and the real wealth of the world is in the hands of workers and producers that are currently undervalued, and therefore that wealth is just unseen. The U.S. countries, and the U.S. and other rich countries have been hollowed out and they're powerless, so their value is overrated. And it's impossible with this pervasive and extreme overvaluation of wealth in some countries and undervaluation of wealth in other countries. It's impossible to be sure whether the world economy is growing or whether it stopped growing at some point, and when it stopped growing. It could have stopped growing. In reality, the real growth of the world economy could have stopped growing as early as 1970, for all I know. My feeling is that at least in the U.S., had met its cusp and was on its way down by 1970. That was about the top. I don't know about the world. You'd have to figure out how to balance the growth of wealth in other countries with the decrease of wealth in the U.S. and other countries. And I don't think, I certainly am not in a place to do that, and I don't think anybody is in a place to do that. So that's the shell game that we're in. We can expect that sooner or later this shell game will end. We'll have a revalued economy worldwide, but I don't think there's any one answer to the amount of wealth in the world economy. It's, I think, in the long run, attempts to compare and to find the total value across the whole world will all founder and fail. But I'll expand on that in later episodes. At this point, I'm just trying to say, well, look, we're in a shell game. I don't know how extreme it is, but you really have to wonder how this would change once the U.S. wealth is revalued. How that will change our valuation of the world growth and an economy. So. In the next episode, I'll be talking about the flip side of some of these discussions where, of course, if you talk about certain countries providing lots of services for other countries in return for a valueless thing called a US dollar, or a low value thing, then you have to start wondering about whether this arrangement could approximate slavery. And so in the next episode, I'll be talking about modern slavery. In the meantime, I wish you a wonderful week. If you know anybody who may be interested in this content, please invite them to listen in, and do keep coming back. Take care.